Hi, I'm Sue Woods. I'm currently interim minister at First Christian in Newton and retired from full-time settled ministry. Before that, I was a professional fundraiser for 10 years, and before that, a mother. So still a mother, but not full-time anymore. So one of my earliest memories was reading the Masonic Bible my dad had, and really just looking at the pictures, first of all, but reading the Old Testament stories, and those really resonated with me because I thought, if these stories about dysfunctional families and a God who loves them and uses them anyway, and stories about scheming people who scheme, people who are unprepared, people who lose things, I'm like, I can get into that kind of faith. So that resonated with me, and they're all the stories that connected me. So my sermons tend to incorporate stories from my own life, mostly. And if I was a better preacher, I'd do it another way, but this is the way that makes sense to me. I've always been a storyteller. My parents called it lying. But I think that, really I've refined that to high art now. Today I want to give you some examples of how I generate a story, and then on the handout there's some specific do's and don'ts that I'll go over with you. And then at the end, maybe during Q&A, we can talk about suggestions for how you might incorporate storytelling in sermons, but also other ways, maybe for the church and for the region. And you can always ask me any questions you want. So I'm just 10 minutes goes fast, so I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is from the scripture about David dancing in his ephod. And I had always been taught when I was young that was his underwear. I don't believe that anymore, but I'm going with it because there's a story you can tell. So I thought about when was a time in my life that I've witnessed something like that. So I told the story about my best friend Sue Buwalda and I in junior high were sitting at our kitchen table, my little tiny house, and my parents got the call that they were going to be grandparents. They'd never experienced the birthing process because my sister and I are adopted, and so they went crazy. They're running around. Sue and I are sitting at the table. Mom's getting her purse. Dad's going to change his clothes. And at some point in the midst of all that, Dad is standing answering the phone, talking to someone, and the phone, of course, is attached to the wall, and he's in his underwear. And it is the one with the boxers with the little tiny toy cars on it. So that is a visual there. And Sue and I were just amazed. And you had to understand that my dad was raised in a Victorian home, farm in Iowa, big farmhouse with 2 bedrooms. The women, the girls and mother, slept in one room, and the boys and the father slept in another. So you never saw Dad in his underwear. And then I connected that to being entheos or enthused with God, in God, and made that part of the story. Another one that I talked about was I think of the time that doubting Thomas, says to Jesus, I won't believe unless I can touch your wound. And I remembered the time, what connected with me was walking into my mother's hospital room on the day before she was going to die, and she's facing the wall, and Dad is facing the door, but he doesn't see me come in because he's applying salve to the bed sore on her bottom. And I thought, who are these people? Because Dad never did anything like that. Mom was the nurse in the family, and Dad, didn't caress Mom in this way. It was, again, a Victorian home, and it was just a really telling moment for me. And that's when I knew that Dad believed in her dying, and I didn't yet. And so we connected that belief in a personal way to the belief of Thomas after he touched wounds, and how wounds can be very healing. So those are some ways that I connect. I usually try to find an emotion or a scene or a character in Scripture that's something I've personally experienced, but it also needs to be a universal experience. So the experience of walking with someone through death process, or the experience of seeing something very awkward when people are so overjoyed that they lose sense of their surroundings and just live in the moment. You need to...
5B points.
That's God. That's going to end up in a story. So you need to find those things that are universal, but also you can give specifics about. The other thing you need to do is shorten it down. I typically write my stories out, and they're 7 to 12 pages or so. I just write them for myself, a memoir I'm working on. If you're going to incorporate that into a sermon, it needs to be 2 paragraphs, maybe 3, and then a little reference to it at the end to tie everything up in a bow. So it really has to be honed down. I'm very particular about my word choice, so I typically don't speak off the cuff. I use notes so that I get the words I want. You need to tell the most compelling part of the story, not your favorite part. One of my favorite parts of a story I told once was a woman who was in a mental institution and just having the time of her life at Christmas. And I wrote that story up and shared it with my storyteller group they were more connected to the moment when I said, because I was adopted, I'd never looked like anyone before. And that's what hooked them. And so I had to rewrite the story for what was most compelling to others. So that's another thing, if you're following along on your page, that's another best practice. You need to be vulnerable. You have to tell stories on yourself, and be willing to share those moments of awkwardness or shame or guilt in a way that doesn't make the congregation too uncomfortable, but you need to be open with that. You need to understand the difference between fact and truth. I told a story about, again, my parents needing to adopt, and in the story I made it that mom was sterile, and I talked about her ovaries and women's ovaries and everybody's ovaries. We got all into that. But the truth was, it was my dad who was sterile. But because of the audience I was in front of and the way I was working my story to talk about my own birthing of my children, I needed to change that. So the difference between truth and fact is, I remember being brought home from the orphanage very vividly, sitting in my mom's lap in the front seat in an old Studebaker, and I can see my brown shoes on my feet. If you ask my sister, I was in the back seat, my shoes didn't fit anymore. What's the truth? Where's the truth in that? Well, it doesn't matter. The truth is that 2 people were willing to bring someone home and love them into a family. So the difference between fact and truth, and don't get caught up in the facts. Use casual language, practice out loud. It's very different than sermonizing. Use your body and your face through all of this, and slow way down and wait for pauses, because hopefully there'll be some gasps or laughter or something like that. Never tell someone else's story, which I think ministers already know. Don't make up statistics, because you'll be surprised how many people will go home and Google that and then come back and be like, yeah, there's truth and fact, but there are statistics. You can't. Don't ridicule anyone, the only exception being yourself. I choose never to be political. I'm in a mixed marriage, and so it's a way to survive in the marriage. But if I am political, I'm equally abrasive, because I think we all fail at finding civility these days and working out solutions. This is important. Never laugh at your own jokes or cry at your own drama. I've been present when pastors have told stories, and they'll get so caught up, they'll get kind of choked up and teary-eyed, and it takes you right out of the story. And it makes you more concerned about the person telling it, are they going to be okay, than any point they're trying to make. So if you're telling it and you're having that reaction, you're not ready. You haven't learned everything you can from that story yet. So don't share it yet. If you're able to tell it without that, then you know that you've learned all the lessons you can. Let's see. Don't ever tell jokes, but you can be humorous. I think jokes fall flat in sermons, personally. And don't use cliches. There's always better words to say it with. You can maybe break that rule once every 4 or 5 times in front of a congregation, but it has to be a really good cliche, like swinging a dead cat by the tail. which is one of my favorite cliches. Let's see. I've got it on the back of your sheet. Your story starts here is sort of a way for you to begin to explore stories for your own self and that you might be able to share. Lessons learned, points taken away. You always want to connect it back to Scripture and the application for now, in this day and age. And I think storytelling helps with that. Last story I'll share with you is the scripture where Jesus is in the disciples are in the boat and there's a big storm and Jesus comes walking to them on the water and they mistake him for a ghost. And so what I thought of was the time one of my children, the two daughters, decided to go through the haunted house in our neighborhood. And I talked about people's love of horror and our love to be terrified sometimes in controlled ways. And they each borrowed each other's courage and we're going to walk through this haunted house. And they got halfway through and my younger daughter refused to go a step further or a step back. And she just log jammed the whole haunted house. They had to turn the lights on. Her dad went in and got her, picked her up, and took her home. And you can automatically see the connection for Scripture where the disciples are calmed and everybody gets to be carried to a place of home or safety. So that's how I do storytelling. I'm surprised how often I hear people say that they haven't heard that kind of sermon before. Like I say, if I was better, I'd do different. But for me, it's natural to connect Scripture to our everyday. But it's not easy. You have to really hone your words and make your points and make it universal and be really gifted at sharing that. If I have time left, how much time do I have left? A minute. So just a couple things, a way that I think we might use them in our churches and in our region. You can always, if you're pastors, start to preach some storytelling instead of just exegesis. But another way, I do storytelling workshops. I go to churches and help people write their stories. There's no charge for that, but I do like to be reimbursed for mileage if it's very far. But I can help congregations to tell a congregational story too, which I think would be fun. And a third way would be for churches or the region to put something out there, a scripture out on social media, and invite people to share a story in response to that from their own lives. And I think we can all use stories to help deepen our faith. So, and then you can ask me questions later. Thanks.